we did a test assembly of all the components of the engine while the new engine was on a stand. And I like to do that just to make sure that the headers fit right, that the distributor goes in smoothly. We also dropped the carburetor on. This carburetor is a Holley Street Avenger aluminum 670 CFM, so it should provide enough airflow for this 383. And it's got you know, all the Street Avenger features that make it nice: an electric choke, vacuum secondaries, permanently installed glass sight plugs so you can check your float level at any time. And one thing that was missing on this car was the transmission kickdown. On Turbo 400s, it's an electric switch, and this car didn't have one. So we found a B&M transmission kickdown switch and mounted it to fabricated billet Holley throttle linkage, which is pulled by a spring. When you put your foot down to the floor, it pulls this spring, which pulls the switch, which is going to be connected to 12 volts. It'll close the circuit and cause the transmission to do the downshift. So we mocked up all that stuff on the engine on the stand because it's a lot easier to do that than it is to lean over the fender, and you're not, you know, risking scratching it up and all that kind of jazz. And you know, just tried to make it as ready to fire as possible. This car also had idiot lights instead of gauges in the cockpit, and I don't ever want to start a new engine without gauges. So we added a set of Stewart Warner Greenline series gauges, oil pressure, temperature, and volts, and a Stewart Warner Greenline tachometer. And Nick in our shop fabricated a real trick triple gauge housing using some 2 1/4 inch exhaust pipe that these 2 1/16 inch gauges slipped right into, and then he powder coated it with a black wrinkle so that it matches, you know, the dash pad and some of the interior texture, so it looks like it belongs. We're going to start this engine on Royal Purple break-in oil, which is a really highly refined mineral oil that they've added a lot of zinc and phosphorus to. So the ring seat, and it's designed to protect roller and flat tappet camshafts. This is a full roller motor, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem, but that break-in oil will allow everything to seat properly and protect the crank and the rotating assembly. And then after 1,500 or 2,000 miles, we'll change this out and run Royal Purple full synthetic. Whenever we start up a new engine, even one that's been run on the dyno, we like to prime the oil pump before we do it. So we made a tool with an old HEI distributor that drops down into the engine and turns the oil pump drive, and you can, you know, spin it with an electric drill or an air drill. I wanted to preset this MSD digital E-curve distributor. Normally, this is the timing graph off the box. I like to cut these out and keep them handy because it's a nice reference. And these are all the different advance curves you can do with an MSD standard Pro Billet distributor. And we wanted to translate this curve, which the engine builder recommended, to the digital E-curve distributor. What he recommended was a black bushing, which meant 18 degrees of advance, all coming in by about 2,200 RPM. So what you do with an E-curve is they've got this chart here that corresponds to some numbers and letters on the bottom. And if you take one of these little tiny screwdrivers and look here on the distributor, you can see you've got 2 dials. These 2 dials correspond to the numbers in this bottom chart. And before we wanted an 18-degree advance curve, well, we can do a 20-degree advance curve here. And what we did is we picked the curve that put all of our advance in, you know, by that 2,200 RPM, by 2,000 or so. So it ends up being H, and then down here, you look at H, which is here, and then if we want to use the vacuum advance also, it would be the combination of 0 and 8 to get the H curve with the vacuum advance. So that's what we set this to. Now the cool thing is over here, this little knob is a 5 to 10,000 RPM rev limiter. It's built in, so you can set this to whatever you want. We're going to set this to 6,000 because that's about where this thing made most of its power and started to fall off according to the dyno sheet. So for the converter situation, we're ditching the stock giant low stall speed torque converter in favor of a TCI Saturday Night Special unit. And the Saturday Night Special is kind of a step up from a stocker. It's not quite a full race torque converter, because we didn't want something that didn't engage until 3,000 RPM. As soon as the stall speed kicks in, the engine will already be in its power band and it'll provide a nice hard launch. Torque converter installation is pretty simple. This time we filled the converter with a quart of TCI Max Shift. It's their new synthetic transmission fluid. And then all you got to do is slide the converter onto the input shaft of the transmission. The only trick is you got to make sure that it seats down all the way. There's a seal and a couple of shafts it has to line up with inside there. So you're not done until it thunks a couple times on its way in. And once it's in, you are ready to bolt it up to the motor. We also drained the trans pan and changed the transmission fluid and filter. This pan had just a little bit of silt in the bottom, but nothing beyond what you'd normally expect, so it seemed to be pretty healthy. And we put all new fluid in it once the car was back together. Lowering the engine in place was kind of a pain in this car because it has solid motor mounts, and it was real hard to kind of hook the transmission and get those mounts to line up. We were pleasantly surprised by how easily these hooker headers installed. We made an attempt the first time to drop them in from the top, which didn't go so well. So again, we put the car up on the lift and they slipped right in from the bottom, and we were able to thread in a couple of bolts on each side without having to alter these things in any way. There was no dinging and bending or pounding or grinding or swearing or nothing. I mean, they really went in nice. The only thing that was to be expected is that the headers, they exited in a different place than the previous set of headers. So we had to modify the existing exhaust system to mate up to the headers. And Nick took a few minutes with some pieces of 2 1/4 or 2.5 inch mandrel bent pipe that we had, and made a couple of little S-turns to reconnect the exhaust. But it really was no big deal. Easiest header install we've ever done. But after that, it was just a bunch of activity, putting everything back together, getting the radiator back in, get the wiring done, get the plug wires on, get the plugs in and tight, get the hoses put back on, get the fluids filled, and get this thing ready to fire. Starting the car was actually kind of a pain in the ass. It didn't want to fire off, the first click like we always like it to, but we're used to it. They never fire off easily. And it was because the timing wasn't set right. I actually labeled the harmonic balancer with an MSD timing tape. This balancer had 4 different marks on it, and we chose the wrong one on accident. So the timing was a little bit too far advanced. And once we figured that out, we fired off and it ran real strong. So when it was all back together, it was time to take it for a test drive. And the first drive wasn't too bad. It wasn't great, but it wasn't too bad. Well, it took a couple of drives to get the tune dialed in. When we first took it out, it had a kind of a bad stumble right as you put your foot in the throttle. So we upsized the accelerator pump discharge nozzles. We've got a nice kit from Holley with a big assortment. And by making those bigger, it gave it a little more fuel on that initial shot, which took care of the bog. And we messed with timing just a little bit more. And now we're talking. Before this car, when it came in here, it wouldn't even spin the tires. Now, put your foot down, you'll leave 100 feet of black marks, anytime. Remember our over 10-second 0 to 60 time in the beginning? Well, this time, with a bunch of tire spin and a transmission, I let it shift on its own just to see what it wanted to do. And it wants to shift around 4,000 RPM, so it really needs a shift kit. We weren't even in the big power band when this thing shifts on its own, but it still knocked down 0 to 60, with all the wheel spin in about 6 1/4 seconds. So we definitely made an improvement. But I think to really make this car kick ass, it's still going to need the gear and a transmission shift kit. The torque converter is real nice. It's right on for this kind of application. And then with the right tires and that gear change, this thing could probably be a high 12-second car. So we cured the problem of this car having no power, but kind of created a new issue. Now it has no traction. But maybe that'll be next time.